My fellow Americans, there comes a time in every nation's journey when clarity must rise above noise, when truth must stand firm against distortion, and when leadership means not simply speaking louder, but speaking wiser. We've seen moments where fear tried to divide us, where ego replaced empathy, and where spectacle overshadowed service. But history has a way of remembering not the noise, but the substance, not the insults, but the integrity. So when words are twisted and truth is tested, it's not enough to sit silent. It's not about clapping back, it's about standing up. Not for pride, but for principle. Not to settle a score, but to remind this nation who we are, what we believe in, and how far we've come together. Tonight, I want to speak not just to the headlines, but to the heart of this country. Because regret may follow arrogance, but accountability always follows truth. And truth, my friends, is where we begin. Dignity must never be sacrificed at the altar of ego. That statement is not just a line for applause, it is a foundational truth for anyone who seeks to lead, to inspire, and to leave behind a legacy that uplifts rather than divides. In today's world of politics, media, and public discourse, it is tempting, far too tempting, to treat leadership like a competition for dominance, a game of winners and losers. But the real test of leadership isn't about who yells the loudest or who controls the spotlight. It's about how you carry yourself when no one is watching and how you treat others when you believe no one can hold you accountable. We live in a time where ego often drives decision-making. We see people in positions of power who are more concerned with their own image than the impact of their choices. They measure success by the size of a crowd, the heat of a headline, or the frequency of applause. But dignity doesn't need a camera. It doesn't need to be tweeted or televised. Dignity lives in the quiet moments, in the way you respond when you've been wronged, in the tone you use with those who disagree with you, in the grace you show when you could easily strike back. Ego, by its nature, is hungry. It demands to be fed. It wants validation, admiration, control. It tells us that we are above criticism and beyond reproach. But when ego is in charge, dignity is pushed aside. And without dignity, leadership becomes a performance, an empty spectacle meant to entertain or provoke, but not to guide or serve. That's when the fabric of trust between leaders and the people begins to unravel. That's when lies replace facts and personal attacks substitute for policy debates. That's when we stop listening to each other and start shouting past each other. But the great leaders in history, the ones we remember with respect, not just fame, have always chosen dignity over ego. They have understood that the purpose of leadership is not to glorify the self, but to serve the many. They didn't always say what was popular, but they said what was needed. They didn't retaliate when criticized, because they knew that maturity means knowing the difference between strength and spite. They didn't seek revenge, they sought reconciliation. And even when the cameras were off and the applause faded, they remained rooted in humility. Now, that doesn't mean they were perfect. No leader is. But they carried themselves with a certain steadiness, a quiet confidence that didn't need to be proven every day. They knew that true strength is found not in the power to intimidate, but in the ability to inspire. And more importantly, they recognized that every action, every word, every decision, especially in public life, sends a message. It teaches others what is acceptable, what is honorable, and what kind of character we value as a nation. When a leader allows ego to override dignity, the consequences ripple far beyond the headlines. It sets a tone for how others treat one another. It normalizes cruelty, dishonesty, and disrespect. It makes people believe that power means never having to say you're wrong, never having to listen, never having to learn. That's dangerous not just for politics, but for society as a whole. Because when dignity is lost at the top, it becomes harder to find it in our communities, our schools, our workplaces, and even in our homes. On the other hand, when a leader chooses dignity even when it's hard, even when they're under attack, they set a powerful example. They show us that composure is not weakness, that listening is not surrender, that admitting mistakes is not a sign of failure but of growth. They remind us that service to others is not about feeding the self, but about lifting the whole. And in doing so, They create space for others to lead with the same decency. So when we say that dignity must never be sacrificed at the altar of ego, we're not just talking about leaders, we're talking about all of us. We all have a role to play in shaping the culture of our communities and our country. Whether we lead a classroom, a family, a business, or just ourselves, we are always sending a message. The question is, are we driven by our ego or are we guided by our principles? Are we demanding attention or are we earning respect? In the end, titles fade, fame disappears, but character remains, and history has a long memory. It remembers those who stood tall when it mattered, who kept their integrity even under pressure, who didn't trade their values for applause. That's what dignity looks like, and that's what real leadership demands. Leadership is about lifting people up, not tearing others down. That truth is fundamental to the very idea of public service. Real leadership isn't about personal attacks, scoring points, or putting others in their place. It's about elevating the conversation, expanding opportunity, and inspiring the people you serve to believe in something bigger than themselves. When leadership descends into insults and division, it may stir up a reaction, but it doesn't build anything lasting. It doesn't leave behind a stronger nation, a more united people, or a clearer path forward. It simply leaves behind noise that drowns out the hopes, dreams, and dignity of the very people that leadership is meant to serve. To lead is to set an example not just for the people who already agree with you, but for the ones who don't. Anyone can criticize, anyone can point fingers, but it takes true strength to resist the urge to belittle others and instead look for common ground. It takes courage to listen when it would be easier to shout, to cooperate when it would be easier to condemn. Leadership demands more than a sharp tongue, it demands a generous spirit. Because when you carry the responsibility of leading others, your words carry weight. Your actions have consequences, and the way you treat your opponents sends a message about the kind of country or community you're trying to build. It is tempting, in moments of conflict or criticism, to fight fire with fire, to meet mockery with mockery, insult with insult, but that's not leadership, that's performance, and while it might entertain or distract in the short term, it doesn't move us forward. What moves us forward is empathy. What moves us forward is a belief that every person, regardless of their background or beliefs, deserves respect. A real leader doesn't rise by tearing others down, they rise by lifting people up, by reminding them of their worth, and by calling them to be their best selves, even in difficult times. When leadership becomes more about tearing others down, the whole tone of a nation shifts. People stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as enemies. Politics becomes a zero-sum game where the goal isn't to solve problems, but to destroy the other side. And when that becomes the norm, progress grinds to a halt. Bridges are burned, trust is lost, and the people who suffer most aren't the ones at the top, they are the ones who count on leadership to deliver jobs, justice, and a sense of hope. That's why words matter. That's why tone matters, not because we have to agree on everything, but because we have to live together, work together, and move forward together. A true leader understands this. They don't stoke division, they heal it. They don't mock people's pain, they listen to it. They don't pretend to have all the answers, they empower others to help find the solutions. They don't look for enemies, they look for allies. Because they know that in a country as diverse and complex as this one, success isn't about winning at all costs, it's about lifting as many people as possible, regardless of who they voted for or what language they speak. History shows us again and again that leaders who lift others up create movements that last. They create a culture where people feel seen, heard, and valued, and that kind of leadership builds trust. It builds coalitions, it builds nations. When you lead with respect and compassion, you open the door for others to do the same. That doesn't mean you won't be challenged. It doesn't mean you won't face criticism. But it means you've chosen a higher road, one paved with principle rather than pride. Leadership rooted in tearing others down might bring short-term headlines, but it rarely brings long-term progress. It might fire up a crowd, but it doesn't heal a country. And while it might feel powerful in the moment, it eventually reveals its emptiness. Because people don't follow anger forever, they follow vision. They follow hope. They follow someone who sees the best in them and calls it forward. even when things are hard. In the end, leadership is not about who gets the last word. It's about who builds the future. It's not about winning every argument, it's about creating space where all people have a voice. That's the kind of leadership that endures. That's the kind of leadership that lifts. That's the kind of leadership this moment demands. Truth doesn't shout, it endures. In a world full of noise, where opinions are broadcast louder and faster than ever before, the quiet, steady power of truth often gets overlooked. But the truth doesn't need to scream for attention. It doesn't need to dominate headlines or flood timelines. It stands on its own, waiting patiently while everything around it rises and falls. Because the truth doesn't chase the moment, it defines the moment. It may not always win the day, but it always wins in the end. We've all seen what happens when misinformation spreads faster than facts, when empty rhetoric overshadows real solutions. In those moments, it can feel like truth is losing. It can feel like shouting gets rewarded and integrity gets ignored. But that's only temporary. The truth may not always be flashy or convenient, but it has a strength that lasts. It is rooted in something deeper than popularity. It's rooted in principle, in evidence, in reality. And reality, sooner or later, has a way of catching up to us all. Real leaders understand that. They don't twist facts to fit their narrative, they adjust their narrative to fit the facts. They know that leadership is not about telling people what they want to hear, but about telling them what they need to know, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular, because they know that truth isn't about control, it's about trust. And trust can't be built on falsehoods. Trust is earned slowly and steadily through honesty, humility, and a willingness to own up to mistakes. The truth isn't always comfortable. It doesn't always flatter us or go easy on us, but it grounds us. It gives us a foundation to stand on when everything else feels uncertain. When lies are told often enough, they can begin to sound true. But deep down, we know better. We know that truth carries a quiet clarity, a stillness that cuts through confusion. That stillness doesn't shout because it doesn't have to. It speaks with authority not because it's loud, but because it's right. There's a reason the most powerful truths in history have often taken time to be recognized. Because truth doesn't operate on our schedule, it moves at its own pace. Sometimes it has to wait for the fog of fear to lift, for the noise of outrage to die down, for people to be ready to listen. But once it's seen clearly, it's impossible to unsee. Once it's felt, it's impossible to forget. In leadership, this principle becomes even more important. When leaders abandon the truth to serve their own interests, the damage runs deep. It creates a culture where people stop believing in anything, where cynicism replaces hope, where the idea of progress feels like a lie itself. But when leaders cling to the truth, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard, they restore that belief. They remind people that facts matter, that honesty matters, that we can disagree on policies without disagreeing on reality. And here's the thing, truth is patient. It doesn't demand immediate praise. It doesn't crumble under pressure. It waits, knowing that time has a way of revealing character. That's why, when leaders tell the truth, even if it costs them votes, approval, or power, they often gain something far greater. They gain the respect of those who may not agree with them, but who recognize the courage it takes to stand firm. That respect outlasts any election. It lives in memory, in legacy, in the quiet gratitude of those who are paying attention. We've seen how lies can spread quickly, how they can stir up fear, anger, and division, but fear fades, anger burns out, division exhausts. What remains, what endures is the truth. It doesn't need to rush. It doesn't need to insult. It just needs to be spoken and then lived. And when it's lived consistently, it changes hearts, it changes minds, it shapes the future. So when we say truth doesn't shout, we're not saying it's weak. We're saying it's strong enough to wait, strong enough to withstand attack, strong enough to rise after being buried, and that kind of strength is what real leadership is built on. Not the strength of volume or vanity, but the strength of values. The strength of knowing who you are, what you believe, and what you're willing to stand for even if you stand alone. because the truth never stays hidden forever. It always comes to light, and when it does, it doesn't just speak, it resonates. It reminds us who we are, and it shows us who we can still become. Real strength is shown through restraint and wisdom. In a world that often equates power with dominance, volume, or aggression, it's easy to forget that true power isn't about who can hit back the hardest or speak the loudest. True strength lies in knowing when not to strike, when not to respond with anger, and when to hold your ground without escalating the conflict. That kind of strength doesn't come from pride, it comes from discipline. It comes from clarity, from knowing what matters, and from choosing a higher path even when a lower one is available. It takes far more strength to pause than to react. It takes far more control to remain calm in the face of provocation than to lash out. The world doesn't need more noise, more division, or more ego-driven confrontations. What it needs are leaders and citizens who can model maturity, who can speak with purpose instead of rage, who can choose silence when others expect to scream. That's not weakness, that's power, the kind of power that doesn't come from intimidation but from self-awareness and confidence. Restraint is not about passivity. It's not about letting injustice slide or ignoring problems. It's about choosing to act with intention instead of impulse. It's about asking yourself, what outcome do I want? And then making choices that move us toward it, not away from it. When someone in a position of influence chooses restraint, they send a signal that emotions don't control them, that anger doesn't dictate their actions, and that they are governed by principles, not pride. We've seen time and time again how impulsive leadership driven by ego or insecurity leads to chaos. Quick reactions often create long-term damage. But when someone leads with wisdom, with the patience to assess the situation before acting, they preserve dignity not just for themselves, but for everyone involved. Wisdom sees beyond the moment. It understands the weight of words, the consequences of action, and the importance of timing. Wisdom whispers while chaos shouts. In any difficult moment in politics, in relationships, in personal life, the easiest thing to do is to retaliate. The hard thing is to think, to breathe, to reflect. That pause is where strength lies. That silence between stimulus and response, that's where leadership is forged. Anyone can react in the heat of the moment. But to lead with wisdom means resisting the urge to win every battle and focusing instead on winning the war for progress, justice, and peace. It's not about being soft, it's about being smart. There is a difference between being forceful and being effective. Sometimes the most effective leaders are not the ones who demand attention, but the ones who command respect by the way they carry themselves. Their power doesn't come from fear, it comes from trust. And trust is built when people see that you don't allow emotion to override judgment, that when tensions are high, you stay grounded. In moments of crisis, people don't look to the loudest voice in the room. They look to the calmest. They look to the one who doesn't flinch, who doesn't overreact, who doesn't need to prove anything because their character already speaks for itself. That's what real strength looks like. It's not explosive, it's steady, it's not reckless, it's measured, and in the long run, it leaves a legacy far stronger than any angry outburst or impulsive decision ever could. Leadership is tested not when things are easy, but when things are heated. And those who rise above the chaos, who navigate the storm with calm and clarity, remind us that power isn't always about control. Sometimes it's about letting go. About knowing that you don't have to respond to every insult, you don't have to answer every accusation, and you don't have to fight every battle. You choose your battles wisely because you know what's worth your time and what isn't. There is strength in knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to wait, when to push forward and when to step back. That balance, that judgment is the heart of wisdom, and wisdom is what transforms raw strength into meaningful impact. So when the moment comes to respond and the pressure builds to fight back, remember this. Real strength doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need validation. It just needs purpose. And when strength is guided by wisdom, it doesn't just protect the leader, it elevates everyone they lead. The American spirit rises when unity triumphs over division. That spirit, woven into the very fabric of this nation, has always found its greatest strength not in times of ease or comfort, but in moments when people came together across their differences. In times of crisis, in the face of adversity, and in chapters of great uncertainty, it was unity, not uniformity, that carried this country forward. It wasn't because everyone agreed on everything. It was because they understood something deeper, that progress requires partnership, that democracy depends on dialogue, and that the future demands cooperation. Division is easy. It takes no effort to point fingers, to build walls, to draw lines between us and them. It's simple to stoke fear, to blame others for what's broken, and to convince people that someone else's gain is their loss. But that's not leadership. That's manipulation. And while division can generate energy in the short term, it drains a nation in the long term. It makes communities weaker, institutions more fragile, and hope harder to hold on to. Unity, on the other hand, takes work, it takes listening, it takes humility. It requires us to see the humanity in others even when they disagree with us, even when they come from different backgrounds, even when their vision for the future looks different than ours. Unity isn't pretending our differences don't exist. It's choosing to respect each other in spite of them. It's choosing to believe that we are stronger when we work side by side than when we stand on opposite sides of the room, yelling past each other. Throughout American history, the moments of greatest achievement have always come when people moved beyond what divided them, when they chose to build bridges instead of burn them, when they focused not on who should be blamed, but on what should be done. From civil rights to scientific breakthroughs, from rebuilding after tragedy to confronting injustice, the turning point has always been unity, a sense of shared purpose, a recognition that we rise or fall together. The American spirit has never been about perfection, it's been about resilience. It's been about learning from failure, standing up after being knocked down, and believing that tomorrow can be better if we work for it. But none of that is possible if we remain divided. Division weakens the foundation of democracy. It makes truth harder to find and compromise harder to reach. It fosters distrust, apathy, and isolation. And when leaders feed that division for political gain, they rob the country of its most powerful tool, its ability to come together for something greater than any one individual. What unity offers is not just hope, it offers momentum. It creates a force that can't be stopped by hatred or fear, because it's rooted in something bigger than any single moment. It's rooted in the belief that every person deserves dignity, that every voice has value, and that our differences, when embraced with respect, can actually become our greatest strength. Unity turns diversity into richness. It turns tension into dialogue. It turns pain into purpose. That doesn't mean unity is easy. It's hard work. It requires us to challenge our assumptions, to step out of our echo chambers, to extend grace when we'd rather seek revenge. It means choosing facts over conspiracy, empathy over judgment, patience over pride. It means recognizing that unity is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of commitment to each other, to the common good, and to the idea that we all have a stake in what comes next. When unity triumphs, people feel it. Communities become safer. Ideas become stronger. Movements become more powerful. It creates a culture of possibility, where solutions can be found not through shouting matches, but through meaningful conversations. Where leadership is defined not by who can divide better, but by who can unite faster, and that kind of leadership inspires, it builds legacies, it changes nations. So in these times, when division feels louder than unity, we have a choice to make. We can give in to the voices telling us that everything is falling apart, or we can listen to the quieter, steadier voice reminding us that we've been here before and made it through by standing together. The American spirit doesn't rise when we pull away from each other. It rises when we reach across the aisle, across communities, across generations, and say, we may not agree on everything, but we agree that this country, this experiment in freedom and democracy, is worth fighting for together. History doesn't favor the loudest voice, it honors the clearest vision. It's not the people who shout the most or dominate every headline who shape the future. It's those who lead with purpose, with direction, with a sense of where we need to go and how we can get there together. In times of confusion, the loudest voices may seem to win attention, but time has a way of sorting through the noise. It remembers those who built, not those who only broke. It lifts up those who pointed forward, not those who only pointed fingers. A clear vision cuts through the distractions. It speaks to something deeper than anger or fear. It speaks to hope, to responsibility, to possibility. The loudest voice might stir emotion for a day, but a clear vision stirs purpose for a generation. That's what separates momentary influence from lasting impact. A loud voice might gather a crowd, but a clear vision builds a legacy. And the people who truly change the course of history are the ones who can see beyond the present moment and into a better future and bring others along with them. It's easy to get caught up in volume, in spectacle, in who can dominate the airwaves. But volume doesn't equal value, noise doesn't equal wisdom. In fact, when a leader's main goal is to stay in the spotlight, clarity often disappears, words become inflated, promises become shallow, and everything becomes about reaction instead of reflection. That kind of leadership may win headlines, but it doesn't win hearts, and it certainly doesn't earn the trust that true leadership requires. Clarity of vision means more than a catchy slogan or a well-delivered speech. It means consistency. It means values that don't shift with the wind. It means telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. It means standing for something even when it's not popular. History doesn't remember those who followed every trend. It remembers those who stood firm, even when they stood alone. Because vision isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do. It's about your actions aligning with your words, your decisions matching your principles, and your legacy reflecting your intentions. The leaders who leave their mark on history are those who chose the long road, not the shortcut. They weren't always the most entertaining, but they were often the most enduring. They looked past the chaos of the moment to the bigger picture. They saw the value in bringing people together instead of driving them apart. And because they had a clear vision, people followed not out of fear or anger, but out of belief. Belief in something better. Belief that we are all part of something larger than ourselves. When the dust of a political era settles, when the headlines fade and the sound bites are forgotten, what remains is the impact. Did people's lives improve? Were institutions made stronger or weaker? Were communities pulled apart or pulled together? These are the questions history asks, and the answers are rarely found in who talked the most or shouted the loudest. They are found in who led with vision, who served with humility, and who lifted up more than they tore down. There will always be those who confuse noise with leadership, who think domination is the same as direction, but history sees through that. It watches how you respond when the cameras are off. It remembers how you treat those with no power. It studies whether your words matched your deeds, and ultimately, it judges not by volume, but by virtue, not by how loud you were, but by how clear your purpose was. The future doesn't belong to those who only want to be seen. It belongs to those who are willing to see further, who can imagine a world not just as it is, but as it could be. That's the power of vision. It creates a path where others only see problems. It offers solutions when others only offer blame. And it brings people together around a common goal, rather than dividing them into opposing camps. So while the noise may seem overwhelming today, and while the loudest voices may seem to control the conversation, they won't define the future. The future will be written by those who kept their focus, who held fast to their convictions, who led not to be admired, but to be useful, because in the end, history honors those who dared to see clearly and who gave us something greater to believe in. So let me leave you with this. In a time when the world feels louder, meaner, and more divided than ever, we are reminded that true leadership isn't about ego, volume, or spectacle. It's about purpose. It's about service, and it's about character. We've seen what happens when leadership is reduced to a performance, when truth is sacrificed for attention, when division is used as a strategy. But we've also seen, and must never forget, what happens when someone stands up not to tear others down, but to lift people up. When they choose restraint over retaliation, Clarity over noise, unity over fear. That kind of leadership endures, it builds, it inspires. It doesn't chase the spotlight, it becomes the light. Because in the end, history won't remember who shouted the most or insulted the best. It will remember who brought people together, who spoke the truth when it mattered, who carried themselves with dignity and offered a vision worth following. And that's the standard we must hold for anyone who seeks to lead not just in our government, but in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our homes. Because this moment demands more than strong opinions. It demands strong values. It demands more than winning arguments. It demands winning trust, and it demands more than loud voices. It demands clear vision. The future doesn't belong to the proud or the petty. It belongs to those with the courage to unite, the strength to listen, and the wisdom to lead not for applause, not for revenge, but for something greater than themselves. That is how change is made. That is how progress begins, and that is how we rise together.